I am going to share with you the fourth installment of our ongoing discussion series. This month, we're talking about stewardship. Again, agenda item 8 on page 16. And if you'll remember, Lois presented general purpose of an MPO in January. Jason talked about quality of life in February. Mike was here last month and discussed safety. And next month, Michael will be here discussing equity with you all. And so the purpose of this series is to provide an opportunity for the SRTC board and committees to build a deeper understanding of some of these topics, have a dialogue, identify some transportation needs and future planning activities, and then later we'll be back to develop and refine these criteria lists. So I know that you've all seen this list quite a few times, probably tired of it now, but we're going to keep showing it with this discussion series. And so part of the reason for this discussion series is in part some of the reaction we got to the unified list process. The board wanted to take a closer look at the screening criteria that was used for the list development. So this will look familiar to you as well. This is the project screening criteria, and I'll zoom in just a little bit. We're focusing on stewardship again today. And before we dive right in, I want to just take a step and just share how stewardship fits into the larger regional transportation framework and where it fits into the MTP Horizon 2045. So stewardship, as described in the MTP, minimizes negative impacts to the natural environment, increases positive impacts to the human environment, improves quality, effectiveness, and efficiency of our transportation system. So there's no doubt that the essence of stewardship overlaps with other guiding principles and policies in Horizon 2045, quality of life, condition of assets, operation, maintenance, and preservation. Are we making the most of the system that we have? And really what that boils down to is this question: what do we need to do? What do we need to consider to be the most responsible stewards of the funding that the region receives? And so we can't think about stewardship in its completeness and minimizing negative impacts to the natural environment without considering this notion of climate change. So what is climate change? I'm going to deep dive a little bit into this slide. So Wikipedia's definition of climate change includes both global warming driven by human-induced emissions of greenhouse gases. We know transportation is a huge contributor to that, and the resulting large-scale shifts in weather patterns. And so why is it important to consider climate change in the context of transportation? Oh, sorry. Let's go back to that slide there. So climate change, we know, is a defining issue of our time. Planners are focused on this all over the United States and the world, from shifting weather patterns that threaten food production, rising sea levels that increase flooding, natural disasters we see here in the Spokane area, fires and windstorms. People are moving all across the United States. Impacts of climate change are global in scope and unprecedented in scale. And all these things can impact our regional transportation system in different ways. And so these changes in the climate can make our facilities vulnerable. You can see that first picture is a snippet of a news article that says climate change may see 1 in 4 US steel bridges collapse by 2040. So it's quite something to consider when we think about our regional facilities. So what can we do? And that sort of leads me to this next concept, and that's sustainability and resiliency. So sustainable development is development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. Again, we're tying this concept of stewardship, climate change. Are we making the most of the facilities that we have? Are we being good stewards of the funding? And are we considering the impacts to the natural and human environment? And sustainable infrastructure and resilient systems go hand in hand. And so resilient transportation systems improve the capacity of physical and human systems to respond and to recover from extreme events. So I want to talk a little bit more about this, and I'll get sort of into the weeds of resilient transportation system. But you can see this diagram is called the resilience triangle, and the figure represents that downward shift is the loss of functionality in a transportation system as the result of damage or disruption, as well as the climbing back out of that hole, the pattern of restoration and recovery over time. So we in our regional system have the ability to make that triangle smaller so that if we do have a disruption, we don't lose major capacity of our infrastructure. And so, when there's less disruption, so when there are climate-related events or major disasters, it's easier for us to climb out of that hole, less expensive. And that's sort of this resilient transportation system. And I'm going to dive into the, it's called R4 framework, and its components are robustness, redundancy, resourcefulness, and rapidity. So the first in the R4 framework is robustness. So robustness reflects the ability of the entire transportation system, including the most critical facilities, to withstand disaster-induced damage and or disruption. So again, are we using the best practices for repairing or weatherproofing our roadways or bridges? Are we focused on maintaining and prioritizing the appropriate roadways, bridges, or other aspects of our transportation system? One thing we can do to increase robustness is increase facility design and construction standards to withstand extreme conditions. And maybe some of this is not exactly in SRTC's purview, but these are criteria questions we can ask about a project. So the second R in the R4 framework is redundancy. Redundancy can be measured by the extent that an alternative route and mode of transportation can be employed if some element of the system loses function. So in this area, I think about windstorms with downed trees or utility lines that might create a blockage on one road. Luckily, lots parts of Spokane are on a grid system, so there's reasonable and safe alternative ways to get from point A to point B. But to build that redundancy even further, we can increase network accessibility and connectivity. So that's the number of roads or transit routes in an area. And you can see this famous green slide. It's been used in a lot of educational materials. You can see that the grid system, if there's a blockage of one road, plenty of different alternatives. The top of the green slide, not so much. For those communities, if there's a blockage, part of that community may or may not be able to get in and out of their housing development. So land use is especially important in this redundancy R4 framework as well. So we currently have projects on our unified list that are parallel routes and that help create redundant networks or improve the grid-like network. So another way we can address stewardship and make our system resilient through redundancy, we can increase transportation system diversity. So we can ensure that there are opportunities for people to walk, cycle, use rideshare, transit, use electric modes of transportation. If one mode isn't available in an area, say for example, transit isn't available, is there a safe place for people to walk or bike to get from point A to point B? We see also, how important other modes can be when there's large events. For example, transit helps transport people from the valley to downtown for Bloomsday, Hoop Fest, those kinds of things. And we can really see how transit can build resiliency in a system, really allows us to make the most of our transportation system, which again is the sort of essence of stewardship. The third R is resourcefulness, and it reflects the ability of the materials, supplies, repair crew, and other resources to restore functionality for if there is some blockage or disruption in the system. And so some of the examples of resourcefulness might be using technology to improve the ability to communicate with transportation system users, even under unusual conditions. And so this is an important aspect of the SRTMC that we have here in the region. Just wanted to highlight that. And then, we could also improve systems to identify potential problems, including physical damage, unusual demands, and new risks. I like to think of technology in this way. One example is these drones that have been used to examine pavement and bridge condition where it may not be feasible or safe for humans to go out and inspect. So just some examples there. And lastly, the last R stands for rapidity. And that really is the outcome of all three. It's the capacity to restore functionality of a piece of transportation infrastructure or in the system in a timely way that contains the losses and avoids disruption. So I like to think about Snoqualmie Pass and how quickly the plows are able to clear roads and make it safe to travel after a winter storm. One way to implement rapidity is to establish ways to prioritize transportation system resources. Obviously, Snoqualmie Pass is an essential east-west connection, but what are the significant transportation resources in our region? And that might not just be physical roads, but it might be technology or supporting other roads and so on. So that sort of wraps up the R4 framework and resiliency and how that ties into stewardship, but climate change and sort of sustainability all in one cute package. So the current criteria that we've looked at for the unified list under stewardship is avoiding increasing single occupancy vehicle lanes, and does the project support electrification? We also had a criteria piece on climate change. Was the project developed with the intent to reduce emissions and improve air quality and reduce vehicle hours traveled? And under economic vitality, we actually asked about increasing, if the project increases the redundancy in areas with limited access. So I'm going to flip to the next slide, and that has all of the current criteria listed in white. There's some other metrics, and this is where I'd like to just open it up to you all and get your feedback on what are the most important factors for us to address. Should we be asking yes, no questions on these? Should we be asking for more specific data types, data points, excuse me? What are the most important pieces to you? And I'm happy to turn it back to you, Mr. Chair, to facilitate that conversation.
Thanks, Kylee. Board members, do you have any comments or thoughts with regard to the metrics that would strengthen our stewardship criteria? I think they like what you did here, Kylee.
It's a lot to take in. I completely can understand that. I like to think of, there's some examples of different projects, different criteria we could look at. For example, vehicle miles traveled. Right now, WashDOT's tasked with developing a process for setting VMT targets. So it's sort of the goal for the state to track, should we be asking those types of questions under the stewardship criteria? Should we ask projects to share specific tailpipe emission savings? Should we ask whether or not they're including new technology or best practices, whether that's, preservation or materials, weatherproofing, that kind of thing. So there's quite a few different criteria that really fit under stewardship, but I guess we'd like to know if there's something that stands out to you that is a little bit more important for us to ask over other criteria. So there's no wrong answers here.
So this is Sev Jones.
Mr. Jones, go ahead.
Hi, thank you. Kylee, that was a really nice presentation. I enjoyed that. And I think all of these are areas to consider and figure out ways to implement these when they become available. In particular, I like the electrification. I think, I was just reading an article today about, gosh, we're if Washington State and even at the federal level, we reach some goals of electrification over the next decade, I think getting ahead of that as much as possible with infrastructure and providing a good analysis of where to get that infrastructure, how to make that work, to support that ahead of time is critical. I also think it's really important to consider land uses, the relationship between how we develop, where we develop densities, mixed uses, things like that, in relationship to transportation networks and, in particular, public transit and things like that. So I've always been interested in looking at the relationship between land use planning and transportation planning and trying to figure out ways to get those two to support each other a little bit more than they generally do. So those are my two kind of areas of interest.
Thank you, Councilmember Jones. Anybody else? Any thoughts? Do you see another hand somewhere?
Sunny Weathers.
Okay. Councilmember Weathers, how are you?
Good, Paul, thanks. Appreciate the chance to share. And Kylie, I just want to echo great presentation. I think stewardship is a big umbrella that often is hard to define, but I think you did a great job there. And I just wanted to point, I'm a data junkie. I think all of these things that you suggest are great data points, but I also think it's what we have as that current criteria are really good questions that can help us gauge and prioritize now. And anything else is, it's extra and valuable, but I don't know that we want to complicate our list too much. So those are just the things that pop into my mind.
Very good. Thank you, Councilmember Weathers. Mr. Gribner, you have your hand up.
Yeah, I want to reinforce what Mr. Jones said and maybe add some perspective to that. So first of all, Kylie, thank you. That was a great presentation. So the one thing that we could spend a lot of time and a lot of detail on is this discussion around land use and what networks are formed and how they're used and what is in those networks. And I think that is it is a little bit missing in this conversation. So I appreciate that was brought up. It's absolutely something that's on our minds a lot when we're contemplating stewardship of the system. Is the network serving the purpose that's intended? Is it an appropriate use of all of the technology that's available to you to provide that service, et cetera, et cetera? So I do think there is some room for us to expand that conversation when we're thinking about criteria related to projects. So thank you, Mr. Jones, for bringing it up. And I just wanted to give it a little extra shot there of support.
Thank you, Mr. Gribner. Extra shot is always welcome. Any other board member comments on this item?
Can I follow up?
Oh, yes, we have our director that wishes to.
Just to follow up on the land use discussion, that is an upcoming discussion series topic. And for that, we're hoping to really devote the majority of our board meeting to it and bring in some panels, do it in a panel format so that we can involve WashDOT and some other agencies to make sure that we're really covering that ground. Mike, I wanted to just follow up with you because I know you use the word stewardship a lot in how you manage and the responsibility that the DOT has in managing the system. Are there measurements or criteria that you don't see here that would help us align ourselves better with some of DOT's priorities as well? Because again, when we're more closely aligned, I think it's easier for us to partner with the DOT and make sure that our goals are all being mutually advanced.
So thank you, Lois, for the question. So I would say right out of the gate, the health of the system and the condition of the system is the first basic stewardship criteria. I mean, that's our first primary responsibility, is to the health of the current system we've already invested in. So that is something that we could contemplate creating criteria around. It is essentially a preservation metric. So there are many ways to measure the system. And you've already mentioned some of them, Kylee. So you have some of those metrics built in here, but we certainly could expand the measurement conversations, the things that we are looking at to gauge the system's health. And again, that covers a lot of things, like whether the system is appropriate, whether you have a network that's appropriate, whether it is congestion you're worried about, or safety you're worried about, or those are all can become metrics related to how you want to gauge your stewardship. So I don't know that we could spend a lot of time on this, Lois. I don't want to consume the whole meeting, but there certainly is some room for some discussion there if you want to explore it.
Very good. Thank you, Mr. Gribner. Any other thoughts? I guess just as a plug, and as being an SRTC board member, these are some of the discussions that I really enjoy that you can take back or have this as a takeaway to your own local government process, that when you're developing policy, this is one I think that sometimes gets overlooked, and that is stewardship. I always appreciate going through these type presentations as a local government official, that you can take this back to your own jurisdiction with some of these thoughts that I think do build better local government policy. So I really enjoy these type conversations. And you did a good job, Kylee. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Any other last statements? If not, Kylee did such a good job on that one. She's going to be called on for the next one. It's titled Toll Credits Policy. Kylee?
That's right. Thank you.